But I will turn things over to Natalie to talk about peaceful minds and peaceful homes.
Thank you, Laura. Hi, everyone. Hope that you've had a great conference so far, and I'm happy to end it with you talking about mindfulness. Mindfulness is so near and dear to my heart. I have been practicing mindfulness in some form or another for the past 20 years, and I have been teaching mindfulness to kids for the past 8 years. And so the beautiful thing about mindfulness is that there are so many different ways that we can practice it, and that it really can shift and transform depending on what we need. And I am going to be giving a lot of different ideas, practices that you can do for yourself and with kiddos during this presentation, but just know that mindfulness is really personal, and the paths that you can take to get to being mindful are so varied. There are so many paths, there's no one right way. So I'll just invite you to take whatever you like from this presentation and use it, and if it doesn't work for you, feel free to let that go. So like I said, I have been practicing mindfulness with kids for the past 8 to 9 years. I was an elementary school teacher before my current position at Denver Public Library. I taught first, second, and third grade, and I taught mindfulness in classrooms with those kids daily. It started with a grant that I had through a program called Modern Mindfulness, and I have that linked in the slide at one point if you're interested in looking. But we practiced daily, and that was really when my own mindfulness practice really grew. So one thing I will say is that the more you practice mindfulness, the better it gets, both for yourself and for the kids that are around you, the kids that you practice with. And since then, now working in the early learning department at Denver Public Library, I have been teaching mindfulness in classrooms, in pre-K classrooms with kiddos and with their teachers on a weekly basis. And we've seen a lot of really great response in the pre-K classrooms with these mindfulness practices as well. So what I am presenting today is really focused on children between the ages of like 2 to 3 and 8 to 9. I think any of these practices would be great for those kiddos. So I'm going to start sharing my screen so that we can look at the agenda for today. Early brain development to get us started, and also stress in the brain, and then we'll jump into mindfulness, more about mindfulness, how mindfulness affects our brains, and ways that we can practice mindfulness at home and with kids. And if we have time, but we might not, there are some slides on self-care and some reflection of how we can incorporate mindfulness into self-care practices. And I know that you'll be getting these slides, so feel free if we don't cover those to just take a look at them when you get them after this session. So Laura has a little poll for us right here before we get started around what your experience is with mindfulness. So if Laura could put up that poll.
Great, I will wrap that up.
Oh, now I can
share that with everybody.
Great. So most people, the majority say they practice from time to time. And some 2 people have actually practiced with students or kiddos before. That's so great. Wonderful. Well, hopefully, regardless of what your familiarity is, you are going to take away some cool little mindfulness tidbits from this presentation. I'm going to start the presentation with creating our own little mindful moment here for you. And so I will invite you right now to find a comfortable seat and close down your eyes if that is comfortable for you, or if not, just soften your gaze. And feel yourself comfortably sitting, but with your back upright straight back, but with some ease in your body. And as we take a few breaths here right in the beginning, let's relax some muscles in our face, relax some muscles in your jaw, your shoulders down your back. Relax the muscles in your arms, your stomach, and your legs. Now let's begin with checking in with how your body is feeling right now. Whatever physical sensations that you notice, areas of tightness, places where you might feel energy and alive. Take a moment to tune into those physical sensations. Now shift your focus to checking in with your mind. Notice if you have a quiet or a busy mind today. Is it clear and focused? Is there some distraction? And see if you can notice this mental activity without judgment. There's no right or wrong way for your mind to be. Just notice how it is. And shift your focus again, this time to how you're feeling emotionally, your emotions. Check in with your feeling state. You might name your predominant feeling, or just notice your overall emotional tone, if it's pleasant or unpleasant. Just notice how you're feeling right now, again with no judgment. Now in these last few moments, notice how these different aspects, our body, our mind, our emotions, all contribute to how we're doing in this moment. All these different pieces of who we are, of how we are, and how they all influence each other. And then when you're ready, slowly blink your eyes open and return to the room that we're in. And so I like to begin a presentation about mindfulness with just a moment of mindfulness, because I think it helps us to start to see what mindfulness can do for us. Now let's talk about the brain before we do some more mindful practices that we can really practice with kiddos. I've never practiced that previous exercise with young kids. That's for adults, but I will be sprinkling practices that you can do with kids throughout this presentation. So here on this slide, you have a brain, or pictures of brains, at birth, at 6 years old, and at 14 years old. And so when we are born, we're born with all the neurons, almost all the neurons that we'll ever have. But what is lacking are the connections or the synapses between those neurons. And so you can see even at birth, those connections are starting to form. And between 0 and 3 years old, children are forming 1 million connections a second, every single second. So the growth and development of brains between 0 to 3 and 0 to 6, honestly, is phenomenal. And then we see in the 6-year-old brain, we're seeing neurons and we're seeing the connections there. We're seeing so many connections. And you'll notice that some of the connections are thicker than others. And that is because those are the pathways that are traveled most frequently. The strongest and fastest paths in the brain are the ones that we use over and over. And I like to think of it with this metaphor of at birth, when we're starting to form connections, it's like bushwhacking our way through a field. The grass is really high and it is slow going to make that connection from one neuron to the next, from one point to the next. But the more often we travel that field, that pathway, the more stamped down the grass gets, the easier it gets, the wider it gets, until that pathway, we've traveled it so often that it's become a road, until we've traveled it so often that it's become a super highway. And thoughts can travel very quickly down that path. That's the work that children are doing between birth and 6 years old. And you'll see it, I'm not going to spend too long, but at 14 years old, there's less connections. That's a great thing. It's neural pruning, and it helps make our brains more efficient. It's that use it or lose it mentality of, if you don't need that connection, if you don't use that pathway very often, our brains will prune it away to help make the connections that we do use more stronger. One thing to keep in mind with this idea of the strongest and fastest paths are the ones that we use over and over, is that this pertains to positive experiences and also negative experiences. And mindfulness and practicing mindfulness over and over will also create its own strong pathways in the brain. The next part about brain development I want to touch upon is that brain development is sequential. Our brains develop from the bottom up. The first part of our brains that develop in utero is the brainstem, the spinal cord and the brainstem. And the brainstem, labeled here in red, is often referred to as the reptilian brain. It is the brain that is in charge of all of our vital functions, our heartbeat, our breathing, our digestion, our sweat response. All of these responses, all of these functions of our body that we don't actually ever have to think about. So that's our reptilian brain, that's our brainstem, and that develops first. In the conscious discipline model, they talk a lot about the questions that pertain to each area of the brain. And this brainstem question is, am I safe? Am I safe? And the next part of the brain that develops is the limbic brain. And the limbic brain is composed of a lot of different parts. The amygdala and the hippocampus are two of the main players in the limbic system. And the limbic system is in charge of our emotions. The amygdala particularly helps regulating emotions. And it's also in charge of our memories and our relationships and our connections. And the question that the limbic brain asks is, am I loved? And then the final part of our brain that develops is the neocortex or the prefrontal cortex or the cortex, and that is our rational or thinking brain. This part of our brain is in charge of our reasoning skills, our problem solving, and it also is in charge of our creativity and imagination. And like I said, brain development is sequential. And the neocortex doesn't actually start developing until we're around 3 years old. And so that's why if you've ever tried to reason with a toddler, it's very hard to do. That's because they haven't actually developed or connected that reasoning part of their brain yet. And our prefrontal cortex continues to develop until we are in our mid-20s, until we're about 25. And car insurance rentals or car rental agencies know this. They will make car rentals more expensive if you're younger than 25, if you've ever tried to rent a car before you were 25, because they know that your rational thinking is not fully developed yet and you might not make the best choices. And so that is a very simplistic idea of how our brains develop, but it gets the point across for this presentation. The next slide, the next part I want to talk about is this hand model of the brain. That's the next picture. I'm going to start my video so I can explain it to you. And so the hand model of the brain is created by Dan Siegel. There's a link underneath it that you can watch after. It's an 8-minute explanation of this if you want to remember it later. But basically the hand model of the brain And if you'd like to hold your hand up with me and kind of take notes in your mind as we go through this, because after I finish explaining it, you're going to join breakout rooms with some friends and explain it to each other to help us synthesize it. But basically, the hand model of the brain is this. We have our spinal cord here, and then our brain stem is right here. So remember, our brain stem is in charge of all of our vital functions and like breathing and heartbeat, and it asks, am I safe? It really cares about, am I safe? And then the next part of our brain that develops is our limbic system, and this would be our amygdala right here, we would say. We actually have two amygdala, but it makes it easy to just do it like this, one. And our amygdala is in charge of our emotions, emotional regulation, aggression control. And so this part of the brain is often asking, am I loved? It has a lot to do with relationships. And then finally, we'll flip over our fingers, and this part represents our prefrontal cortex. And our prefrontal cortex is in charge of our reasoning and problem solving, self-control, and its main question that it asks, I forgot to mention this, this main question that it asks is, what can I learn? Or what can you teach me? So we have these three parts of our brain. Our brainstem, am I safe? Our limbic system, our amygdala, am I loved? And then our prefrontal cortex, what can I learn? And so what Dan Siegel talks about with this hand model of the brain is that oftentimes when we have really strong emotions, our amygdala becomes very active, and it's kind of like it's moving around so much, it's wiggling so much, and it's so active that it actually causes us to flip our lids. So it's moving and it's wiggling so much that we flip our lids, and our prefrontal cortex is no longer connected. We no longer have this integration of our whole brain. Our reasoning brain is not connected, and that's why when people are really angry, kids or adults, they don't often make good decisions because they do not actually even have access to this part of their brain until they can calm down their amygdala and their limbic system. And so what I will be teaching you today with some of these mindfulness practices are ways to calm down your limbic system, to calm your amygdala, to create less activity there, to allow us to have our brains fully integrated and to make really good choices. Does anybody have any questions about that little hand model of the brain before we go into breakout groups? And if not, then Laura will put us into some breakout groups with about 3 partners that you will get to explain this to each other and work together to remember the different pieces. I think it's really great to practice this right now while you have the chance, because this hand model of the brain is an amazing tool to use to talk to parents and kiddos about emotions and how we can help calm our emotions to make better choices. Kids respond really well to this hand model of the brain.
Great. So everybody, I'm going to place you into breakout groups.
Do you all feel like brain scientists now? Like brain development experts? Do you feel like you could use this tool with kiddos? If you need a refresher, the Dan Siegel video is a really great one to watch. But I have used this with kids, and watching it click for them that like it's not their fault when they can't make good decisions, you know, is really powerful. But they can be empowered to calm themselves down so that they can make good decisions. It's really cool. Okay, we are going to talk a little bit about stress in the brain. But first, I want to do our first practice that we can do with kiddos, and it's called star breath. So if you'll do it with me, we're going to spread our hands out wide like a star. I've also called this roller coaster breath, like you're riding on a roller coaster, but I like star breath better. So we'll take our hand, spread it wide like a star, and then you take your finger of your other hand, and we're going to trace our hand up. When we inhale, trace up the finger, and as we exhale, we'll trace down. And we're going to repeat for every finger. So we'll do it slowly, and it's great to model doing it slowly with kids, because sometimes I like to go quickly through it. You can also talk about doing it as slow as a snail or something fun like that. So we'll do it together. Inhale. Inhale. And exhale. Inhale. And exhale. And inhale. And exhale. And last one. Then you can shake it out. You can also repeat and do it on the other hand. It's really great. I see that somebody does this in Head Start. One of their kiddos does this in Head Start. And I teach the Head Start kids that I go into their class to do this. And they usually request this one as one of their favorite breaths. It's nice because you kind of form this connection to your body while you're doing it too. And it's kind of soothing to sweetly touch your hand like that. So it's really nice for kids to do. Let's talk a tiny bit about stress before we talk about brain, mindfulness and the brain. So there's so much that we could say about stress and the brain and how stress affects the brain. But one thing I do want to focus on just for this presentation is our negativity bias that we've developed as human beings over hundreds of thousands of years. So back in the day when we were like out and fending for ourselves, if we were walking through a field and saw a large object behind a bush, and we said to ourselves, oh, "That's a lion, run! We're gonna be eaten for lunch, run, 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 run." If we saw that large object, assumed the worst case scenario that it was a lion and we ran away, we would survive. If we saw that large object behind a bush, we assumed it was a lion and it was actually a rock, that doesn't matter. We still ran away, we still survived. On the other hand, if we were walking, we saw a large object behind a bush and we said to ourselves, oh, never mind, that's just a rock, no big deal. And we stayed where we were, or we continued along our path towards that presumed rock. If it's a rock, fine. But if it isn't a rock, if it's actually a lion, we will have just become lunch. And so evolutionarily, humans that believed the worst, thought that the worst was going to happen, were the ones who survived. And so we have this, what's called a negativity bias. And what we can do is keep this in mind, knowing that we have 40 to 60,000 thoughts every day. The majority of those thoughts are negative because of this negativity bias. And that causes stress for us. And what's known is that it doesn't even matter if the stress is real or perceived, our bodies and our brains still respond in the same way. So even if it's just a rock, if we think it's a lion, we're still going to have those higher stress levels and higher cortisol in our bodies. So I just point this out because mindfulness can help us kind of separate from that negativity bias. Mindfulness can help us create a little bit of space between a thought and a reaction and say, oh no, maybe I don't need this negativity bias right now. Maybe I am safe. I don't need to perceive this as an unsafe situation. Because what we know also about stress, it's all around us. We've evolved to experience it. It keeps us alive. But also stressful experiences cause a downshift for us to lower mental states. So we want to be in this executive state. We want to be in this learning state, and we want kids to be in this learning state where they are able to problem solve and have rational thinking. But every time children and adults experience stressful situations, it's going to move them back down into either their emotional state in their limbic system or back down into their survival state. And that's where we see that fight, flight, freeze response happening. And what mindfulness can do is actually help to calm. It can create space in between perceiving an experience and reacting to it. But if we do react, it can also help us move back up from our survival state back into our rational thinking state. So I have this little video that I would love to show. I think this video, I'm going to skip into it a little bit. This video was made by some parents at a school. I believe the school is in California. And they just had begun teaching mindfulness in this school system. Their child was in first grade when they started teaching mindfulness. I think that they had filmed this video a year or two into the mindfulness curriculum at the school, but they just interviewed kids and just asked them about what mindfulness means to them. So they didn't prompt the kids in any way, and this is the response of early elementary school kids.
When I'm mad, my brain can get a headache and it can start hurting.
Your blood keeps pumping because you're like really mad. And you start to get sweaty because you're getting really, really mad. And then when you start getting really mad, you turn red.
When your body can't really control yourself, mad just takes over your body. I just get out of control. It's kind of like if you had a jar, and then the jar would be your brain, and then you put glitter in the jar, and that would be how you would feel. If you shook up the jar and the glitter went everywhere, that would be how your mind looks. And it's like spinning around, and then you don't have any time to think.
And you sometimes punch stuff and people when you don't really mean it.
When I get angry, I feel it in my heart.
I really don't like when I get angry.
The amygdala really reacts, but the prefrontal cortex tries to keep it down.
When I feel like I want to, get really angry and yell, I just sometimes, take deep breath.
First you find a place where you can be alone, then you find some way to relax and calm down.
When I need to calm down, I take deep breaths.
I breathe in through my nose. Sometimes I close my eyes or just take deep breaths.
It's calming down, it's not moving. It's slowing down and then it stops. And the heart pumps slow and then it goes into your brain.
It's like all the sparkles are at the bottom of your brain.
My brain slows down, and then I feel more calm, and then I'm ready to speak to that person.
I love that video. I find it also makes me feel a little bit calmer when I watch it. I especially love how that video incorporates what we were just talking about with the brain science behind mindfulness of calming down your amygdala. And it uses this really great metaphor of the glitter jar. And I'm sure that many people have seen these glitter jars. I've made them with a lot of my students, and I've been making them in library programs recently. And it's a great way of thinking about our brains all shook up and all agitated when the glitter is going, and then finding ways to take breaths and finding ways to practice mindfulness, to allow that glitter to fall back down to the bottom of the jar, to calm our brains, to calm our amygdalas, so that we can make better choices. And so I wanted to take a minute right now to ask you all, what does mindfulness mean to you? So if you could, just in the chat box here, just type a few words or a sentence of what mindfulness means to you. These are great. Yeah, I often see people talking about the moment, being present, calming, awareness, that's a great one. Awareness of mind and body, peacefulness, definitely a side effect of mindfulness for sure. Changing state of mind. These are great. So I have a couple definitions to share with you now. So these definitions are some of my favorite ones. There are so many definitions. John Kabat-Zinn, he was one of the first Americans to bring this concept of mindfulness over to the West. He has a program called Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction, which has had a lot of research done that mindfulness does actually decrease our stress. His definition of mindfulness is awareness, I saw that in some of your terms, that arises from paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally. I love the on purpose in this. We have to choose to be mindful. And I love the non-judgmentally part. And we'll talk a little bit about why it's so important to be non-judgmental a little bit later. And this quote is from Thich Nhat Hanh. He's a Buddhist. I love this quote so much because he brings in the idea of our bodies, our emotions, and our minds, which was how we started off our meditation or our mindfulness exercise at the beginning of this presentation, was checking in with our bodies, checking in with our minds, checking in with our emotions. And Thich Nhat Hanh expands it to also encompassing the whole world. And I love this last sentence, that we avoid harming ourselves and others through practicing mindfulness, through having that awareness. And then finally, this definition by Rebecca Shamoun Chinook. She is a psychologist, and her definition, that intending, that purposefulness again, intending and developing the capacity to come back to center and pay close attention to our sensations, thoughts, emotions, and the surrounding environment. So those are all the same categories Thich Nhat Hanh was talking about. And she adds, with engaged curiosity, equanimity or evenness or non-attachment, deep compassion, and acceptance. So those for me are really powerful definitions of what mindfulness is for different reasons. There's a link here when you get these slides. You're welcome to explore even more definitions. I found a really great website that has definitions by leading researchers and spiritual practitioners with what mindfulness is. That being said, mindfulness does not have to have any spiritual affiliation, but there are a lot of spiritualities that practice mindfulness. What mindfulness is not, it is not about trying to create a blank mind. Our mind evolved to create thought. That's the purpose of our mind, honestly. And so we're not trying to get rid of that. We're just trying to change our relationship to the thought. We're trying to create that space between our thought and our reaction. One of the programs that I used when I was teaching was called the Emotional ABCs. It's a great program. Teachers can get it for free. Parents, there's an online program that costs some money, but for teachers it's free. And it talked a lot about how we have to push pause on our reactions. We have to push pause and rewind and like understand where we are before we can click play and make good choices. And so I think that that is a really beautiful way of explaining mindfulness, is that we're just pushing pause, taking account of what is going on in our minds, bodies, emotions, and then pushing play and responding in the best way possible, instead of the normal course of action, which is thought reaction. We want to get rid of that reaction. We want to create some space there. So here's a little practice of mindful self-compassion. Go back to my video. Many researchers talk about how it's really important to practice non-judgmentally, that we're not judging how we are in any moment. And Dr. Kristen Neff is a researcher who has been developing this idea of mindful self-compassion, and they have found that when we practice mindfulness in a compassionate way towards ourselves without judgment, we're more likely to continue practicing. Which makes sense. Like, when have you ever done something and been berated and then wanted to keep doing it? But mindfulness is hard, and sometimes we can have those negative thoughts to ourselves of like, oh, I'm not good at this, oh, my mind keeps wandering. Her idea is that we should practice self-compassion, kindness towards ourselves, treat ourselves the same way we would treat a friend. And there's a link there on that slide to a lot of her exercises that you can do. There are ones that you can listen to and also ones that you can read on her website. They're aimed for adults, so I have adapted one that I've used with kids, and we are going to do that practice right now. So it's about being mindful and also being kind to yourself. So what we're going to do is rub our hands together. If you want to join me, we're going to rub our hands together until we can get them feeling nice and warm. This is fun to do. Kids like it. Get them warm, and then place them on your bellies. Can you feel the warmth of your hands on your bellies? So we're connecting to our bodies right now. But we're also going to say some kind words to ourselves. We're going to say, I am strong. Actually, we're going to say, I am safe. That's what I like for this belly area. I am safe. Just say it to yourself. Say it out loud. And then rub your hands again and rub them really, really fast. And have fun with it. Whew. Okay, and then take your hands and put them onto your hearts. You feel the warmth of your hands on your hearts. And you can say to yourself, I am loved. I am loved. And then we'll rub our hands one last time. Make it the hottest you can this time. And then you can put them on your head and say, I am strong. Or you could say, I am smart. I am smart. And then you're all done. Kids love this one. It's really great because you're connecting not only to your body, but you're taking a moment in each spot to breathe, so you're connecting to your breath. And we're also just taking that moment to imbue kids with some positive self-talk. And how kids learn to talk to themselves in their childhood is most likely how they'll continue talking to themselves as they get older. And so we have a lot of opportunity to give them positive self-talk through doing activities like that, and that helps them to develop self-compassion, which will help be more successful in the future. Go back to my presentation. Ooh, now we get to chat about the benefits of mindfulness. So mindfulness has so many physical and emotional benefits that have been studied. It is known to reduce stress and cortisol, the stress hormone cortisol in our bodies. It reduces the perception of pain. It improves sleep and reduces insomnia. I have experienced this for real in my life. I struggle with sleep, and mindfulness has really helped me to have more consistent, great sleep. It strengthens our immune system. And I think this goes hand in hand with reducing cortisol. Cortisol causes a lot of inflammation in our systems. And when we have a lot of inflammation, it's harder for our immune systems to function. So if we're reducing cortisol, we're reducing inflammation, and then we're also supporting our immune system, which is great. Reduces blood pressure, reduces symptoms associated with anxiety and depression. I definitely came to mindfulness to help manage anxiety and stress, and I have seen a lot of benefits from that in my life. It protects your telomeres. This is really interesting. They have done a lot of research around in our DNA, our chromosomes. They basically have these little caps on the ends of them, and those caps are called telomeres. So what happens over time is that our telomeres wear away, and that exposes our chromosomes to degradation, to begin unraveling. And when our chromosomes are being attacked and unraveling, that's what causes us to age. Like, it happens over time naturally. It's a normal process. But with mindfulness, it actually protects your telomeres. It lengthens your telomeres. It kind of like strengthens those caps on the ends of your chromosomes so that your chromosomes don't degrade as much. So it actually, protecting our telomeres keeps us from aging. Not indefinitely, but it protects our bodies from the effects of aging, which is really interesting. It also improves self-regulation. That's when I was talking about that, being able to just push pause before reacting. It improves our executive functioning, which is made up of our working memory, our cognitive flexibility, and our self-control. It helps us be more attentive and improved long-term focused attention, because it's building stamina in anything. So we're building stamina in being able to focus on ourselves in this present moment, but we can then turn that stamina of being able to focus on any other task that we need to do too, which is really cool. When I was teaching, my students when I was teaching first and second grade, on their end of the year, or their standardized testing assessments that we took at the beginning, middle, and end of year, students in my class were consistently growing 2.5 years in math and 2 years in reading in just 1 year. And I think a lot of that was that they were just able to sit and focus and learn. And they were also able to sit and focus and take a test, because I don't think those tests necessarily show us what kids know. But if they know how to be able to sit and focus on a test for 45 minutes, even as a first grader, they're going to do better. And then also just in an overall improved quality of life. So mindfulness has these great benefits, and mindfulness also physically changes our brains. So we were talking about our hand model of the brain. We were talking about our limbic system. We have our amygdala in there, which is what gets activated when we're having strong emotions. The amygdala in people who practice mindfulness, even for as short as some of the studies that I read were as short as 7 hours of practice, can start to have these effects. But also, like, a lot of the studies were practices of 8 weeks, practicing mindfulness for 8 weeks or more. But your amygdala is smaller. This area of your brain that reacts and has strong emotions is actually smaller and less active in people who practice mindfulness. And then also part of this limbic system is our hippocampus. That's in charge of our memory. That actually grows bigger and more active. So we have better memory when we practice mindfulness. And then our prefrontal cortex also has more gray matter, is also bigger in people who practice mindfulness and is more active. So we're more able to make those better choices. Also, we can think about our brain having pathways up from our brainstem to our prefrontal cortex. And so if we're continually traveling on this pathway to our prefrontal cortex, we're strengthening that pathway to our prefrontal cortex, and we're making it more likely that we will be able to walk on that route to our prefrontal cortex over and over and over again, even in times of stress. The other great thing about mindfulness is that it not only affects us, but it also affects the people around us. So it's known that children are still working on self-regulation. Remember, their prefrontal cortex only starts developing at 3 and doesn't finish till 25 years old. And so they're working on being able to regulate themselves, and they will regulate to whatever level the adult around them is regulated to. So if you're functioning out of your survival state, that is where a kiddo near you is going to function from as well. But if you're able to be functioning out of your prefrontal cortex, children will pick up on that, and they will also unconsciously be able to function out of that part of their brain as well. You can notice this with adults, not just children. If you're ever in a meeting with a group of people, it's a very interesting experiment to just be as present as you can, slow down your breathing as much as you can. Just be calm, like channel that mindfulness in that moment, and you will notice that the people around you in that meeting's breathing will start to match yours. And it's a really cool thing to notice, but we co-regulate to the people around us, and that's a survival skill too. And it's important if there's someone very stressed out near us that we're also alert, because why are they stressed? We need to know. And if they have a reason to be stressed, we should also be alert and ready to respond. But remember that negativity bias, and that sometimes people are stressed when they don't need to be. And so sometimes it behooves us, it's better for us to be calm in that moment and then help spread that calmness with people. And that is what this picture right here depicts. That we can either spread our stress, or we can spread our mindfulness. We can spread our sense of safety and well-being. And so we can ask ourselves, what do I want to spread right now? I've been doing a lot of research around trauma-informed care recently, and how we can be really responsive to kids' needs. And so I just like to include this slide when I'm talking about mindfulness, that traditionally mindfulness is thought of as this thing that you do, you sit completely still, you close your eyes, you have to practice for a long period of time, and it's all about your breath. And breath is definitely a great access point for mindfulness. But for some kiddos, or for some people that might have experienced some trauma, sometimes it's hard to focus on our breath or our body. So you can always give options. And I think it's just all about options. If it's hard for you to focus on your breath, focus on what you hear around you. If you don't like closing your eyes because that makes you feel unsafe, keep your eyes open. If sitting still is really hard for you, you can move around, or you can hold on to something in your hands. When I teach kids yoga, I've been teaching kids yoga for the past year. And when we do our little meditation or our little relaxation at the end, I often give kiddos little stuffed animals or little beanbaggy things to hold on to. I mean, this was before we've been quarantined, but we were doing this practice of like holding on to something in our hands and letting us focus on that as well. And also, you should never say that mindfulness must be this practice of this many minutes. Start small and build stamina. The same way that you start small when you're training and learning how to run or lifting weights at the gym. It's the same idea. We start small and build stamina as we go. Okay, so mindfulness is great. It does all these great things. It's going to keep us from getting old, and it keeps us from being stressed out, and it helps us make better choices. So how do we practice this? When I was practicing with kids in classrooms, when I was teaching, and also now when I'm doing it in classrooms throughout Denver, I try to keep these components in mind. So firstly, I think it's really great to have mindful moments, and I'll talk more about that in the next coming slides. And then also having some mindful messages that talk about what mindfulness does for us and in kid-friendly language. And then I use those mindful moments and those mindful messages, and I create a mindful moment basically with breath, with tuning into our senses, with movement, with affirmations and self-compassion, and with gratitude. And so I will get into what a mindful moment looks like for me when I'm talking with kids. It is brief, always short. We're not trying to draw this out, and explicit teaching moments of like, this is mindfulness. I'm telling you right now, this is mindfulness, and this is what mindfulness can do for us. And it's great to practice multiple times a day if you can, every day if you can, at least once a day if you can. And they can be really short practices, just 1 minute if you're starting with younger kids, 30 seconds if you're starting with younger kids. They don't have to be long moments. It's great for you to physically model what you want the kiddo to do, both because they learn from watching. People can often learn from watching, and also because if you're doing it, you're regulating yourself in that moment, and that kiddo will be able to co-regulate alongside you. And then last but not least, when you're thinking about creating these mindful moments, be sure to encourage kids and validate their experiences, whatever they're saying. If they say, this is boring, say, you're right, it can be boring to sit here quietly. This is hard. It is hard for me too. You're right. Practicing mindfulness is hard. It's really great to just validate and meet kids where they're at, because this is tricky work. It's hard for adults who have their prefrontal cortex already developed. So it's definitely hard for kids to tune in and try to connect to that part of their brains. And just encourage, and don't give up yourself either. It's easy to feel discouraged when you're trying to do this really cool thing with kids that you know is going to be great for them and they are not into it. But don't give up. Just keep trying, because the benefits are there and they're proven. So my mindful message is composed of, or my mindful moment is composed of a mindful message and then some sort of practice. Mindful messages, I took this idea from the Modern Mindfulness website and course that I had taken. And I was doing this like 8 years ago through this course, so I don't know how active they are on that website anymore. But the idea of mindful message is really simple. You basically say, when we are mindful, and then you talk about what kind of benefits come from that. So we know, I took these 3 little bullet points off of the benefits slide, that mindfulness gives us less stress and anxiety. Mindfulness makes us more capable of self-regulation, and mindfulness gives us better executive functioning. So every week when I was working with my students, we would make one mindful message for the week. And I would usually make it on my own and put it up on the board and leave it on the board for the week. So you're not making a new mindful message every day, or you can make a new mindful message every day. Or you can make ones that work. And if you try it one day and it doesn't work, go on to something different. If that one works, keep it for a while. But an example of mindful message would be, when we are mindful, we can focus. Or when we are mindful, we are more happy. We are happier. Or when we are mindful, we make good choices. So I want to give you a second now in the chat box, could you think of a mindful message that you could share with kiddos in your life that would benefit them? It could be around any social emotional skill that you're working on, or any development skill that you're working on. When we are mindful, we know how we feel. That is great. I love that one. While you're typing, I'll just take a moment to answer this question. Jessica asked, how much mindfulness does one need to practice in order for these things to happen? One of the recent compilations of studies that I read said that there were noted benefits of people having practiced mindfulness just 7 hours in their whole life, but that more results were found after having 8 weeks of practice, of daily practice. But the beautiful thing about mindfulness, and that makes sense of what I just explained, is that mindfulness is dose dependent. The more mindfulness you do, the more dose you have of mindfulness, the more results you'll see. So honestly, you can see mindfulness after the very first time you practice it. I don't know if in the beginning of this presentation, when we practiced that one little short practice of mindfulness, if anybody felt less stressed or calmer. But the more you do practice mindfulness, the more effects it will have. And there are studies of people that have like 30,000 lifetime hours of mindfulness. And those are people that kind of go and do like retreats, like year-long mindfulness retreats. And they definitely have way different brains than we have or will ever reach. But even just practicing short bits daily or weekly will make a difference for us. Okay, let me see some of these other ones.
Natalie, just a heads up, 10 more minutes.
Thank you. When we are mindful, we can relax. Oh, we're in charge of our character. We can respond better. Great. We show how we really feel to our family and friends. Those are great. So those are some great examples of ways that you can create mindful messages for kiddos, which allows you to teach it explicitly to kids. Because it's so important to explain to people, to kids and adults, like the why behind why we do things. If you don't have a strong why, people are not as likely to follow what you're doing. But if you have a strong why we're doing this, and you call it out over and over, like, oh, I see you're being mindful right now. You are sharing. When we're mindful, we share our toys. You are being mindful and you're sharing. I can notice that. The more that we can do that, the more kids will see the benefits, and the more likely they'll be to continue on with the practice even when it's tricky. Okay, so I want to share some breaths with you. We've already done star breath. So I'll quickly explain bee breath. We can do that one together. So bee breath is basically just humming. A bee sounds bzzz. I turn it into just a hum sound. And when we hum, it vibrates a nerve in our body, the vagus nerve that runs from our brain all the way down into our reproductive organs, the longest nerve in our body. And when we vibrate that nerve, it calms our entire body. It activates our parasympathetic nervous system and it calms us down. So humming, it's so simple, and it has a physical calming effect on us. So when I do it with kiddos, I usually, we talk about like, well, what does a bee sound like? Okay, well, let's see if we can sound like bees, and let's see if we can, how long we can sound like bees. Let's take a really deep breath. So breathe in and fill up your belly. And now let's breathe like a bee. Good job, that was a long time. So let's see if we can do it even longer, and we can even change how our bees sound. Let's breathe in. That's a really fun one. I also have used a Hoberman sphere. There's a picture of that Hoberman sphere there. It's a little it's a little toy that expands and contracts, and that's really great for teaching how our lungs work and how our bellies work, because we're really trying to get our bellies to expand and contract when we're breathing. All of these breaths that are on here, I'm not going to go through any more since we're running out of time, but they come from this book, Breathe Like a Bear. It's a great book. It's available in English and Spanish, and I actually included a book list to be sent out to all participants that I put together of my favorite mindfulness and yoga books together. I'll say that these 2 YouTube channels that I listed are also 2 of my favorite. I noticed that somebody in the chat had mentioned that they use bubbles to talk about breathing, and these 2 links are breathing with bubbles that expand and contract. It's really great to watch, and then some shapes that expand and contract. And those are really fun if you have the ability to use screens to teach, to have that visual aid. Okay, so we're making a mindful moment. We've talked about our mindful message, and then we're choosing some sort of mindful activity. So maybe we choose breath, or maybe we choose our 5 senses to go into. And we can use our 5 senses to just connect to the world around us. So mindfulness, using that calming glitter jar would be a way to use your visual, your sense of sight, and talking about mindfulness. Using your sense of hearing to just think about the sounds that you hear in the room around you. And even if you can expand beyond the room around you, and maybe you set a little stopwatch, like we're going to listen for 1 minute to hear all the sounds that we can hear around us. The sense of smell, I've taken like a tissue box and turned it into a mindfulness scent box, and I'll put different materials inside, so maybe like orange peels or cinnamon sticks or flowers that I've found, and then we'll pass that around the room and let each kid just take time to smell and connect to that sense of smell and think about what it is. Your sense of touch, any tactile experiences that you can give kids. I've seen like kinetic sand or those little water balls that expand and they're really fun to touch, or putty or Play-Doh. But just like being present with that sense of touch, or different textures. And then mindful eating, the sense of taste. You can practice mindful eating with kids. And that is really a great way to slow down and just enjoy. If you're eating an orange or a little tangerine, like before you even peel it, can you hold it and feel its texture and smell it? And then when you peel into it, can you smell it again? And then when you're peeling it and then you take your first bite, being mindful with like, what tastes do you notice? Just slowing down and like asking those questions around like, what do you notice right now? There's also a really great 5 senses guided meditation where you basically ask the kiddos, you count down. So 5 things you can see, and name the 5 things that you can see around you. And 4 things that you can touch. Name 4 things that you can touch and maybe notice their different textures. 3 things that you can hear. 2 things that you can smell, which can start to get a little bit tricky, but you can try your best. And then 1 thing that you can taste, or I always add that you want to taste, or the next thing that you'd like to eat. Okay. And then the last part I'll share is that movement can be a really integral part of mindfulness, especially with younger kids. Movement really helps us be present in our bodies. We have those 5 senses I listed on the last slide, but we also have other senses, our proprioceptive sense and our vestibular system. And these senses have to do with spatial awareness and balance, and they're totally activated through movement. And we're running out of time, but there are links here for all of these. Anne Green Gilbert is an amazing researcher who basically studied how babies develop movement and how that movement develops their brains, and has created programming around that for older kids and even older adults, and how we can reactivate our brains and repattern our brains through movement. And her songs are really great And also I found these really wonderful YouTube videos with a lot of the same big body movement that helps us be mindful under the Yo-Reimi Kids Yoga. And then I will say that if you try to incorporate all of these things with just a little bit of explicit messaging with kids about how beneficial mindfulness really is for their lives, I think that you will have a positive practice that you can grow into with them. And like I said, mindfulness is a really personal practice, and it can have a lot of forms and a lot of different paths. And these are just some examples of what I have found to be successful with the kiddos that I work with. The last one on this list is gratitude. Practicing gratitude is a really great way of being mindful of all the good that we have in our life, also counteracting that negativity bias. So if you'd like to take one moment, we have 1 minute left, to share one thing that you're grateful for in the chat box. That would be lovely. There are a couple slides here on self-care that you're welcome to look through. Mindfulness as self-care, and then there's a handout for some self-care practices that I put together that will be given to you in your resources from this presentation. So feel free to take it, edit it, to find ways to incorporate some self-care into your life during these trying times. And the very last thing I want to reference is on this resources slide here, there is a link for a free 40-day mindfulness course. And I recently stumbled upon this through some studies that I've been doing. And it's a lovely course. I've been doing it. I'm like 2 weeks into it. And they're basically 10-minute mindfulness audio practices where they spend the first couple minutes teaching you something about mindfulness, and then the next few minutes actually sitting in mindfulness. It's free, and I have really enjoyed it, so I wanted to share that with you. I know that we are at the end now. My contact information is on the last slide. You're welcome to email me with any questions, and thank you so much for taking some time to learn about mindfulness, and I'm excited for your paths as they unfold in this great practice. And I'm really happy reading all your gratitudes. Thank you for being here. I'm grateful for all of you.